call this work session to order for rental housing registration program, for a rental housing registration program. Is my microphone okay? Okay. Turn it down? No. Okay. We have a couple of memos here on our desks, or in our box this afternoon.
Kathy?
Yeah, Jack?
Is this being filmed?
I do not know. Yes, this is being filmed. Okay. Instant gratification there. Thank you, Marie. Okay, so our agenda bill summary statement. On October 27th, 2014, City Council held a hearing on a proposed rental registration program. At the conclusion of the hearing, we assigned the matter to the Committee of the Whole for further review. There are a couple of attachments with this. One is a frequently asked questions document, a draft registration only ordinance, and public comment received since the 10/27 agenda packet. I think I only have one printed item for additional public comment. Does that sound accurate to you guys?
It was all emailed to you.
Okay, so in addition to email, this is the only other item?
That must have come from somebody.
Okay. Okay, I think I'm going to turn it over to staff if you would prefer to get us started, and then we'll go from there.
Members of the council, a couple of matters just to preface your discussion on this. The first is clearly staff will develop appropriate program to fully implement the policy intent that you reach. So our role is to take your policy, to work the details, to develop an implementable program and come back to you with that and how it proceed. A couple of things in discussion and in comment, much has been made of the business licensure program, getting a business license. While there are certain similarities in that one pays for that, and there are some limited enforcement activities for folks who don't have it, they're not strictly an apple-to-apple comparison, largely because of if an inspection component is included, it does bring in a number of other issues that is atypical for a business license. You don't go out and inspect the site. Moreover, if someone doesn't get their business license per se, you can pursue it as an enforcement matter. However, it's not a health safety issue in terms of affecting the remedy. If we find an inspection, for example, that has a adverse condition, we can't just say remedy it at some future date. If it warrants immediate repair or replacement, you have to go for that level based on health safety. That being said, we do think that the program that would solve and address more fully both a registration and inspection program would need to be mindful of the breadth of a process needed to implement it. That would include data entry, scheduling, the vehicle costs, billing, enforcement, travel costs, training, public information, and any transmittal costs. And the program we look to develop for you based on your direction would include all of those. So it's not just the cost of the inspector, it's the cost of supporting the inspector, the indirect costs that are necessary, and you need to be aware of all those expenses before you're actually going to launch the program itself. So those are our comments at present.
Okay, great.
Is that what you're meant?
Yes, that basically describes a scenario where after the policy decision is made or to inform that policy decision, you would ask staff to develop the program more fully so we can come back. If you've gone to the City of Seattle website and seen how rental registration does, it's developing the process, sweating the details, coming back with the assessment and the costs.
Okay.
Terry and then Michael.
Yeah, at the end of the public hearing last time, we had asked about staff having comments relating to the things that they had heard regarding like compliance with building codes and a lot of those, and it was my understanding that staff was going to address some of those today. Is that because you didn't want to address them then?
Right.
And so are you going to address some of those today?
You want to go? We did do that in the frequently asked questions document that was a part of the council packet. I don't know, Peter, if you want to go through that quickly or not. We can go through that with you if you'd like.
Well, I think since this is televised and there's a lot of people that watch this that don't have a copy of that, I think it would be very helpful so that they hear that same thing, because they watched the hearing and heard the comments, and so I think it'd be very helpful if staff could address that. So
I think that's fine. Let's hold on that, though, and let me take Michael's comment, and we'll come back to it.
Mine may actually be out of sequence. I would just want to make a comment on the whole business license thing, that one reason to consider the similarity would just have to do with ease of implementation. If we could piggyback on a business license financial system, that would be a reason to. But if it isn't easier, then it's just, to me, it's an implementation issue. But
Sure.
that's all.
Okay, great. I want to make sure we all have the same stuff in front of us real quickly. So, of course, we have our agenda bill and attachments. We have a memo that Rick produced that I sent out, and a sample of checklist items. We have, I think this is from Jack, rental safety program policy questions. Is that correct?
Yeah, for discussion later.
Discussion, and something from Michael. Okay, a big memo from Michael.
The table in the back.
With the table in the back, okay, great. Okay, so everybody has that. Are folks okay with a bit of a high level, maybe, is that Peter who would go through the FAQs and give us a little bit of a response to what those items cover? Okay, let's do that.
Okay, Peter Raffato, City Attorney's Office. So kind of following along the Q&A document, one of the questions that came up was, if my rental property is very old, how am I expected to make it meet current code requirements? And the response to that in the document, and I'll go over a little bit here, both Jim Tinner and I worked on the response to that. And as Jim has pointed out, there's a misconception that a rental housing unit or any other unit would have to update to current building code standards. There is a provision, and keep in mind that the ordinance as proposed and any ordinance that comes out will, thanks Kurt, any ordinance that comes out is really going to incorporate the building code and the fire code as it currently exists. And in that code, it talks about that any existing structure, if it was code compliant when it was built, it will continue to be code compliant. The only exceptions, there are some exceptions in the International Maintenance Code, and those are really the items that you would find in the checklist that I believe has been provided to council.
Everybody have them.
In addition to that, it would be easy to insert into the ordinance some clarifying language so that that's very clear. Another question was, how long does it take to obtain repair or re-roof permits for my property? And in that document, you see Jim has provided some some information that is really from the permit center, but I think the key thing to keep in mind is that the ordinance will have a period of time in which an individual will be able to correct any defect prior to there being any sort of enforcement action. That's how the city always conducts its code enforcement, and that's how it would be conducted under any program before there would be an issuance of some sort of notice of infraction. The next question, I'm concerned about my rental property not meeting the minimum room size requirements of the building code. Again, that goes back to that first Q&A where there are already provisions in the code. And I guess let me back up for a second. This ordinance does not impose any building code requirements that don't already exist in the building codes. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that I anticipate that would be present in any final ordinance as well. But as far as minimum room size requirements, That, again, is under that same provision that you don't have to update so long as you're meeting the basic health and safety standards.
Can we ask questions?
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to ask one too.
So, in reading the checklist items that Jim had put together, I just want to make clear is that the only requirement of having to upgrade, regardless of when you actually built, had to do with fire egress? Because, I'm reading here, there was, that it seemed like, regardless of the age of the building, that you really did have to have the fire egress component of it. But all other issues had to do with whatever the code was at the time that the building was built and the permit was issued. That's,
Yeah, Jim, can you come up and speak into the mic?
and if the answer is generally, are there exceptions?
There are some exceptions. Not a very comprehensive list of exceptions. The state law in rental licensing limits us to looking at safety and health issues. So there are some health issues, some dilapidation that might happen that may not be relevant to fire safety that an inspection program might look at. Sanitation issues, lack of hot water. There's somewhat of an abbreviated laundry list of those items in addition to fire safety.
Okay.
Jim, while you're there, is mold going to show up on any of those?
Mold is more a symptom than a code violation in its own. It's typically a symptom of either a leak somewhere or inadequate ventilation. If one of those two items are shown to be the cause, yes, there would be corrective action required. Oftentimes it's because folks like myself will put things up against an outside wall and not realize there's no ventilation, so I'm getting mold back there. That's more of a behavioral issue than a code issue.
Okay. I just learned something. Guess that mold was my fault. Okay, any other questions right now? Kelly?
You might as well stay up there. And the other issue with mold that I just learned was, Jim, do you want, or is it you that answered my question about danger of mold? I mean, what mold is dangerous and what mold?
We discussed it, yes.
Maybe you could share that with the
Okay.
council too.
This knowledge is from some FEMA training I had on the Mississippi coast, so I'm not sure exactly how relevant it is. But out of all the varieties of mold out there, there are only a couple that are dangerous to people. So says FEMA. Typically, you're either allergic to mold spores, in which case you've led a fairly miserable life because they're everywhere, or you're asthmatic. So people with asthma can be very susceptible to mold.
Yep, Pinky?
I want to add a point that anybody who has any cancer or going through any cancer treatment, that mold and fungus are very, very susceptible to that.
Okay, so let's keep going with Peter's.
Okay, so continuing on, and this looks like this was basically a question posed straight out of the current state law regarding repairs made to a rental unit. Can the tenant pay for repairs to a rental unit after notifying the landlord? And if you follow RCW 59.18 and the specific provisions in that section of the statute, there is a process for doing that, and I won't go into detail here, but the tenant would have to follow some very specific procedures for doing that. That is an option, and then deducting that from the rent. Next question. The rental registration program requires landlords to certify that their property complies with the building and fire codes. How am I, as a landlord, supposed to certify that my rental unit is in compliance when I can't see inside the walls or under attic insulation? So the language in the current proposed ordinance talks about conditions that are presented, which means that the conditions cannot be discovered. They're only conditions that can be that would be something you would discover after a reasonable and thorough review of conditions. And so we could actually easily add language into the code that would make that more clear. Next question. What sort of items will be looked at during the rental safety inspection? And the current ordinance limits the scope of the program and the rental safety inspection to items that endanger the safety or health of tenants. No other building or fire code deficiencies are allowed to be included in the inspection. And there is, and that's ultimately the purpose of the checklist that is being developed.
With that specific one, could it be added, since it's for health and safety reasons within the checklist, about meth contamination as something being checked?
Yes, my understanding of meth contamination, the issue there is going to be, it actually requires some expertise in actually obtaining the sample and having that sample tested. So whereas I think meth in general obviously can be considered a health and safety concern, we'd have to talk about how that would be implemented.
Okay, just curious.
Thanks, Terry.
Next question, who will perform the inspection? Under the current proposed ordinance and as required by state law, the property owner or landlord may hire a properly credentialed private inspector, and as it's specified in the current ordinance, it does state that you can request a City of Bellingham inspector to perform the inspection. Right. I mean, the intent of the fee for inspection for a city inspection, it isn't specified in the ordinance, but I think the intent was that there would be a fee that would cover that cost if a city inspector is the one doing it. The next question, I would defer really to Jim on this, but it talks about the percentage. There was a comment about the amount of housing inspections and what that would result in terms of finding of problems. And it's identified here that HUD inspections, in terms of looking at that data, there's a review for general conditions beyond health and safety, so those numbers may not be applicable to the ordinance that's being proposed. Next question, what will the city do about code enforcement found during a rental safety inspection? And really it would be handled the same way we have code enforcement processes. If there's an immediate hazard, the rental unit may have to be closed until repairs are made. But a lot of times there is a time period given for those repairs to be made before there's any code enforcement action. How long will the landlord have to correct violations? As stated here, our current code enforcement methods typically allow for 15 to 30 days, depending on the severity of the situation, and there are exceptions made where the landlord or individual is making efforts to come into compliance.
Peter? Just to be clear, I guess just the way that maybe, Jim, how you're thinking about handling this, if we do pass something like this. With the Housing Authority, the way that they run their inspections, they have emergency repairs, I forget they had different degrees, and depending on the type of repair that needed to happen, that you would have a certain time period in order to correct it. It's either 24 hours, it was 72 hours. I think that one had to do with maybe a week, another one for a month, to be able to do that. Is that the way that you're thinking in your head about how we would be, or how you currently do that with just even with building inspections?
I don't foresee any change in our current procedure. We do that now. We prioritize lack of heat, lack of hot water. Those are pretty important. If it's summertime and there's no heat, well, that's not going to be quite as much of a priority as it is today. So the Landlord-Tenant Act provides some very specific time frames that the landlord has to activate those important items, and those are the time frames we use as well. As a matter of fact, we have an inspector out on one today, no hot water. We learned about it this morning. He's there at 1 o'clock.
Okay, thank you.
And the last question on the document, how have the fines been set for this ordinance? And really the numbers here the fine of $200 escalating to $500 per violation is consistent with other jurisdictions, keeping in mind that fines would only be imposed if the attempt at code enforcement was not successful.
And I had a comment about that.
Go ahead, Jack.
Well, we heard a few comments at the public hearing about the fine structure and about immediately getting fined the $200 per day, but there's another section, just a few sections above where the penalty section is, under subsection .110, that says before the city suspends or revokes a registration or imposes penalties, that the person shall be given a specified period of time in which to correct the violation. So it underscores the fact of what you just said, Peter, is that we're, through due diligence of working with the property owner, that we need to remediate the problem and give enough time, depending on the schedule that Jim just laid out, to be able to do that before we get into a situation where we want to even consider a penalty.
Roxanne.
I'm not suggesting this, but another way that I've seen this being handled is that if it's a major fix that has to happen and the landlord feels that the time provision isn't realistic, I've seen it where court systems actually can intervene and you can plead your case in front of a judge or a hearings examiner or something to that nature, who can then work with the city to help the city understand. So that's just another alternative.
Anything else, Peter? Okay. Any other questions from council at this point? No? Okay.
I do, sort of.
Okay, Michael?
At some point, I'd like this addressed. It doesn't have to be now, but it has to do with the option to choose an outside inspector. I've been told by one individual that they need to get their units inspected every year anyway as a requirement for their bank loan for their building. And looking through here, I couldn't find language. I don't know if I missed it or not. Can someone submit an inspection that the director can determine is as good or better and covers the same scope? If that inspection is just as thorough or more thorough, is there an equivalency? And assuming they have, again, qualify with the same qualifications, and I'm assuming if the bank is using an inspector, they're going to qualify. Is there a mechanism for someone to be able to submit another kind of inspection that's equivalent, and the director can anoint that one, even if they didn't inspect for this reason, but they inspected for other reasons? Does the ordinance allow that, or how does that work?
As Jim works up, I'll say typically can. There's standards that other communities have established for this kind of inspection. You'd have to meet those standards to qualify for it. If equivalent standards, we've likely would accept it.
Rick's correct. If we establish a set of qualifications, we would establish a roster of the folks we know of that meet those qualifications. Anyone else that wanted to perform an inspection would simply have to submit their qualifications to the department for review, and we'd accept that inspection.
I guess if we're going to inquire inspections, I think we should make all the room possible for an equivalent inspection if one occurs. That's all.
Yeah.
Jack?
Do you have to be on the roster in order to submit an inspection for a property owner at the time that?
That's part of the program we'd need to develop. Whether one could need to be pre-approved on the roster or whether the credential alone is sufficient.
I would want credential alone.
What you said,
Okay. Let's try to move this forward a little bit. Does everyone have a memo from Rick to me about some ideas for a program? There are two items in the beginning. The proposed process below is predicated on the following two overarching principles. I'm going to read those and check in with folks about these principles. Rental housing in Bellingham must be safe for the renter. That's principle number one. And number two, any proposed program must be cost neutral and not adversely affect other ongoing processes and initiatives. That's principle number 2. Michael?
I think those are fine principles. I would just say being realistic on the cost neutral. I think there may be startup costs that I hope would be recovered eventually. That's all.
Okay. Anyone else? Seeing some nods and, okay, Jack?
Yeah, these are fine. It's a snapshot of something that the council on June 17th, 2013, that we unanimously approved goals, outcomes, and guidelines associated with this program. You know, I guess these are inclusive in there, but just a small component of everything else that we talked about in terms of how we would frame this.
Good. Terry?
And I'd just agree with Michael. When we look at revenue neutral, that needs to include startup costs being recouped, but initially there may be costs that would be recouped later through the program with that.
Okay, I want to check in also and ask, these are pretty basic, which is good. If we can agree on basics, that's good. However, any additional basic principles at this time anyone would want to talk about? We can always return to this idea. Okay, so seeing nothing, you can continue to ponder it and we'll come back, but seeing nothing right now, let's move down the document. Consistent with these principles, we could direct staff to develop a program for consideration that includes a couple of items. Rick put a couple of ideas here that we discussed, that we thought we had heard through the public hearing process and in our discussion as a council after that. And I'm going to read these. 1, 2, 3, 6 items. Establishes review standards for health and life safety based on those found in the Landlord and Tenant Act. That's attachment A, the sample checklist that we've already seen. Identifies the process and requirements necessary for establishing a roster of qualified private sector inspectors who can be approved by the city and provide the inspection service to rental property owners. I'm sure we can have some interesting discussion on that. Identifies costs to both the city and rental property owners that would be required to develop, implement, and support a pilot program. It's anticipated the term of the pilot program would be 3 years to allow for a fair assessment of both the need and efficacy of facilitating rental registration. Can I just get through these and then I'll come back to you, Terry? Just real quickly. The 4th one, evaluates incentives for early registration and inspection. The 5th one, identifies the cost of the city to enforce regulations during the term of the pilot program. And lastly, 6, requires staff to report back annually to council on the status of the program. Terry?
Yeah, I got some concern about the term pilot program because that's not what we were looking at doing. It's establishing a pilot program. That's something totally new, so I've got objections to the word pilot program because we were looking at establishing a program with reviews, not a pilot program implies something else.
Okay, that could have been a reflection of my personal bias.
Well, I've got concern with that.
Okay. Anyone else have some response initially? Pinky?
Well, I'm going to say that I think saying it's a pilot program is kind of in response to some of the things that we heard is, do we need this or not? And I think this is an opportunity for us to actually evaluate that. So that's where I thought the term pilot program came through.
Okay. Yeah, actually, you just jogged my memory. I'm going to speak for a second. After the public hearing, I walked away feeling, I've really been on the fence on this inspection thing. And I walked away feeling like very clearly we lack good information and that's not okay. And I think we can all agree about that. I could get excited about a program that wasn't permanent and wasn't expensive that gave us information. And so I think that's what I communicated to staff.
You could come up with a different word, just program. You don't even have to put pilot in.
I think what I'm trying to say is if we discover we don't have a problem that warrants all of this, we need to have a way to get out of it. I doubt that will be the case, but if that is the case, we need to have a way to get out of it responsibly. Michael and then Terry?
I think I agree with Terry, though. I wouldn't want to call it a pilot program. In my memo and elsewhere, I think the program needs to be evaluated as we go along, and maybe at the end of a 3-year period, assuming we've inventoried most of the properties, that'd be a perfect time for reevaluation. So I agree in principle with that, but I wouldn't want to call it a pilot program. I wouldn't want to intend it to be. I think keeping rental housing safe is a permanent and ongoing need, and I would imagine something might be needed in place eventually. So I would strike the word program, but certainly keep the idea of a reevaluation.
You would strike the word pilot or program?
Pilot, sorry, pilot.
Okay. That's what I would
Right.
assume.
But I would definitely, continuous reevaluation is always a good thing. And
Yep.
after several years, a longer, more thorough reevaluation is in order, I think.
I'm going to take Terry and then go to you, Roxanne. Terry?
Okay. Yeah, in terms of a way out, as a council, we always have a way out. All it takes is 4 votes and we're out. That's a simple, we're looking at Clean and Green. That was something we established. It wasn't established as a pilot program, but we're changing it with a vote of 4 people. We're doing different things. We may abolish it as long as we got 4 people. If we're going to establish and put in place a review process, then we have a way out. And any new council coming in can change that. So that's already there as part of this. So,
Thanks, Terry.
yeah.
Roxanne?
I just wanted to make a motion then to finalize this. So I'd make a motion that we list this as a program that will be reviewed at 3 years.
Kathy?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. I'm going to call on Mayor Kelly.
And that probably works out just fine, because the idea was that we would look for 3 years to try to get units inspected, and then we would also build into here the incentives and all the other things that we're talking about. So I think taking the pilot out, I agree with Terry, you always have time to change something with 4 votes. I think the idea was that how the program looked at 3 years might be different than how it looks after 3 years, and I think your motion covers that.
Yeah. Okay. We have a
But
motion.
who's flying the plane?
Any
No,
further
just-
discussion on Roxanne's item? A motion? Sorry. I'm going to speak to it. I feel like we just have a tendency to put government systems into place that a new person comes in and doesn't want to second guess it because they're new. And what do I know? I'm brand new. And suddenly it's been 7 years or 20 years that we've got Clean Green being subsidized. Sorry, it's a bad example. I know people love it, but I'm just saying. It's not as easy as we like to think it is to reverse course. So I'm just going to put that out there. Any other discussion? Okay. All in favor of the motion to change this wording to a program, not a pilot program, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
But when-
Nay.
Just to clarify, Roxanne's, it was the review of a program after 3 years, which
Yes.
is different than what was stated in here. And I'll vote aye for that one.
I'm sorry, Jack, can you restate what you just said?
I'll just paraphrase Roxanne to say that it was, that we would review the program after 3 years.
Okay, and so what I said, removing the word pilot, but also that we would review it after 3 years.
Yes.
And all those in favor, who said aye?
Aye.
Aye.
And any opposed? No, that's me. So motion passes 6-1 with Lehman opposed. Okay, moving on. Michael?
Item B there about a roster, I have slight problems with it, but maybe it depends on how it's implemented. I have no problem with if we have an in-house list or a local list of qualified inspectors, that's fine. I don't want a roster to be a qualification list that you have to be on, and I don't really think we should spend too much time in making sure that the roster is up to date. I don't think that's an essential part of the program at all. We already know who the qualified inspectors
Yeah,
are.
that's
so.
a good point. So can we speak to that a little, can we get a little feedback from staff? So one thing we discussed was potentially the reality of getting units inspected in the city of Bellingham might conflict with our idea of how quickly that can occur with the existing number of inspectors who are qualified to do this. Sorry, I kind of butchered that statement, but I think this idea was from something we discussed about potentially the city could help identify who these people are or even train some of them in the checklist for this program so that folks would know who they could go to easily. And considering the fact that we might have a lot of people needing inspections, there could be a glut and back up our ability to meet that need. I'm sorry, I haven't eaten lunch. I'm going to ask if staff has something to add
If
to
I
that.
could respond.
That makes sense.
Eat, Kathy.
Thank you.
And we could send out for a granola bar.
Yeah, well, Pinky
did.
brought me something. So.
Good. The 2 points, I'll just use Seattle's model. Seattle is conducting a class now. They've established standards, and they're conducting a class to get people up and running to do it. Part of our process, this direction would let us go out to establish a reasonable standard of saying, here's what you need to do, or an equivalent. And likely, in Seattle's case, as I understand it, they felt there were inadequate folks to do the inspection. They went to do a class, actually a class is starting within the month, to bring people up to speed on how it could be done. Whether we would do that or not is something we'd have to research and see who's available to do it. And the key is to have the timely turnaround and meet the targets of the program.
Okay. Michael, Pinky and then Michael.
I actually think we should vet the contractors. And I think there should be a certain level that we all agree on and that we know that everyone has met whatever those specifications should be. I don't think we should limit it, but I think that we should vet all the contractors, and everybody who gets certifications should come from that approval list. That's just my opinion.
Michael and then Terry.
I think I'm going to, sorry, Pinky, directly disagree. I think state law already provides the qualifications. I just don't think, I think it's extra work for us and unnecessary work for us to have them not only be qualified under state law, but also be sort of vetted by us. I love what I heard, though, that it may be very important, and people would voluntarily maybe want to take a little hour continuing education class with our building official to make sure they understand the checklist and they can go out because they're already trained and qualified people. So I think I think we agree that it should be qualified people. I just would like to have as few elements to our program as possible, and pre-approval of people I don't think is necessary because state law already sets a bar.
Did you want to add anything?
No,
Terry?
I
Okay.
don't.
I don't think this one is potentially mandatory at this point for us to figure out, so why don't we continue moving? Okay. I do think it's pretty important we talk about the checklist. How about we do that? There is a proposed checklist based on standards for health and life safety found in the Landlord-Tenant Act. That'd be great, thank you. Roxanne?
I just also want to say that we reviewed this at our committee level. So this isn't the first time some of the community has seen this.
I'll eat my soup soon.
Actually, to be clear, we reviewed Jim's first draft, which was this is a part of that, or the first one was a part of what Jim finally completed, the entire package. So there is more in here than what we had before.
Sorry, this is fairly short. It would be 2.5 pages front and back. I know we fantasized about 1 page front and back, but
It's equivalent to what a lot of other communities that do have inspection programs, what they're looking at as far as basic minimum health and safety issues. This kind of covers the extent of it. And it doesn't have to be too exhaustive, but it does have to have at least some things in here. And quite frankly, most of the length of this has more to do with the description of what it is
the explanation.
than the actual item itself.
I'm going to ask for folks' reactions and feedback to this. I'm going to say first, I wonder if people's expectation about mold is going to be caught in a checklist like this. If there's anything we really, what can we do about mold issues, considering I will admit I caused my own problems myself. Also, electrical items, I'd like to hear from staff on how much we might actually feasibly catch with electrical items. But I'm going to ask for some more comments, and then maybe, Jim, you could come up and address a number of things. Michael?
One, I actually appreciate that these are drawn and from specific citations from the International Property Maintenance Code. Unlike the memo, I don't think that the focus should be on the Landlord and Tenant Act as the source, but on the International Property Maintenance Code as the source. So I really appreciate how these were drawn from it. I think that is a very appropriate. On the matter of mold, I think the legislature in Olympia has kind of tied her hands on that and actually has said specifically mold is not regulatable. Instead, as Mr. Tinner indicated, mold is a symptom and what's regulated is the cause rather than the mold. So it's frustrating. I'd rather we just talk about mold, but I think our hands are a little bit tied on that one. And then my final comment is I don't know which of these checklists would cover the case of someone whose, say, bathroom subflooring was rotting due to continuous water exposure and it's soft and it's squishy. That seems really unsafe, but I don't know where that sort of thing would fall in here. It's not an exterior element, it's not a fire egress, it's not a window, it's not a stairwell, it's not electrical. Would soft, squishy subflooring in the bathroom be covered on the checklist? This particular
Let's run through a number of scenarios, right?
Yeah. Michael, on that one, there is a checklist, plumbing system free from leaks. And anyone doing an inspection and you've got spongy floors, they're going to look for plumbing leaks because that's what's causing it.
I just want to make sure we capture all of what my common sense, my layman's idea of what a bad condition is that might actually be threatening health and safety. Would this capture it? Thank you, Mr. Tinner.
Yes, Michael. Keeping in mind that the state law limits these inspections to health and safety, we can't look at general building conditions. So let's take the spongy floor. If it's spongy to the point that it becomes a tripping hazard, absolutely, that's a safety issue. If it's just a little uncomfortable, but it's not a safety hazard, we can look at it, well, is it symptomatic of another problem we need to get at, i.e. the leaking plumbing? So can we write a correction to replace the spongy flooring in the bathroom? Probably not.
Okay, so unless your foot is going through and you're falling down to the next floor, that might not be that overt. Okay, Terry?
But if you're looking at leaking plumbing as a cause of that, you can write a correction notice for replacing the leaking plumbing, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Jack?
Under what your thought is about something like this as a specific example, leaking plumbing could be one cause, but also, like in a tub, and you're taking a shower, you're spilling a lot of water out because you're not using a shower curtain properly. It's more of a tenant issue, it could also be a landlord issue depending on the curtain design.
Been to my house, haven't you?
But in a situation like that, I would think that one of the services that we could provide, even though you may not go and write them up for failure, is to at least notice the tenant and the property owner that this situation's occurring. It's destroying the bathroom floor, and it will become a problem in the near future. Is that the way that you're thinking about how this would get implemented?
I don't think we had vetted it to that extent. I don't think there's anything, though, in the state regulations that prohibit us from giving advisory counsel to the landlords. We couldn't write that as a correction, but we could certainly counsel them.
Okay, that's good to know.
Okay, great. Any other comments at this point? Pinky?
Just one quick one. For mold, we could, just have it as an educational tool, not a violation. And the Northwest Clean Air Agency and the Opportunity Council, they both have great educational elements on how to get rid of mold and clean, and we could just notify them they have mold, and they can take care of it. Would that work?
I'm sorry? Yes.
Roxanne? And then Terry?
I'm going to repeat what I said during our committee as we were developing this universal checklist. I would love for this to become the major educational component, with less words, with just more bullet points. Because if our tenants understood these very simple things, and these are the things that they should be watching out for, we would have such safer units when we could work with our landlords to get a lot of these things remedied. So I hope this will be the educational component, a major part of it.
Cool, thanks, Roxanne. Anyone else right now on the checklist?
Are you going to show the whole checklist on the board?
Sure,
Or
do you,
no, we're only doing certain sections. Just so
I'm
people.
just taking feedback, but we can,
No, just so the audience can see the
yeah,
whole list.
well, I mean,
Or we can make copies, whatever.
it's 5 pages.
Yeah.
Could we
Yeah.
make a bunch of copies and make them available to folks in the audience? Let's do
Okay,
that.
that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you, Marie.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Jack?
So, one thing I didn't see on the checklist had to deal with pest issues, if there was visible signs of pests. Or are there, any other type of vectors? It would seem like on the exterior, it just says, structurally sound and sanitary, but, some pests are interior, and I'm just wondering how that gets covered. Because, some of the comments that we have heard over the last few years had to do with that as an issue, either rats or ants or, whatever.
I think I intentionally left that off. And I think the reason I did was because in a lot of cases we'll get complaints of I hear mice or rats in my attic. So an inspector will go out, pop their head up, look for feces, look for some obvious sign and not see it. Where a professional pest exterminator might have much better qualifications than us. And again, we're limited to health and safety. I have to go out there with a good heart and say that I see a safety violation or a health violation for this tenant. And I think a lot of times with insects and vermin, we don't have that expertise to do it. If there's something obvious, absolutely, we would put that down.
Okay,
because
so
the IPMC does prohibit it.
Okay, so if you saw physical evidence, interior physical evidence, that you would write that up as a
Yes, sir.
complaint?
Yep.
What one would that fall under, Jim?
Again, this is a draft document, and there is language regarding infestation vermin in the IPMC. That could certainly be added as another bullet point.
Another one that's worded like visibly checked for this item and did or did not see it. Okay.
Usually with infestation, it's latent. That's the problem with building inspectors trying to find the infestation. There was a recent case in Idaho. They had 4 inspectors over 2 years looking at a house. They said, we see snakes. You may have seen this one on the news. The inspectors could never see the snakes. The people eventually paid to have the house demolished. There were over 4,000 snakes in the wall.
Jim, that's a horrible story.
Maybe in your wall.
We do not have a lot of snakes in upper Northwest Washington, thank God. Michael?
Hard to follow that. But going back to the potential pests or vermins, or for that matter, the potential spongy floor, I think we would want to inspect for obvious degradation that's gone to the point of failure. If there's a little water dripping and it hasn't damaged the floor yet, that's not it. If there may or may not be ants or may or may not be rats, that's not a failure.
Right.
If it's obvious there's rot, if it's obvious there's failure, I think we're trying to catch egregious conditions.
Right.
And if there's a beginning of a condition, that's not a failure.
Right.
That's not something we hold against you. That's just wear and tear and will probably be fixed, presumably, in due course.
Right, that's a good point, Michael. Jack?
I guess another question for Jim. You said that you didn't want to include this on the pest one on the inspection sheet. Are there other ones that you have concerns that you held back on putting on this sheet?
Probably at least 3/4 of the property maintenance code is not included on this sheet. There are things such as peeling paint that are regulated by the IPMC. They certainly are not health or safety until they're to the point that the building is dilapidated. Height of grass is regulated out of the IPMC. Dirty windows,
No.
IPMC.
Oh, okay, no way. I don't clean my windows. I'm not going to point at anyone else.
Are there any of them that you see that would be on the fringe of being a health and safety issue that, you know, because certainly pests are, but are there others that you were considering? Yeah, I wouldn't consider height of grass or peeling paint, but, you know, are there other ones that might be there that you held back?
Most of them, remember the property maintenance code is exactly that. It's about maintaining your building. It's not, by the time most of these items would come up, the property maintenance code would tell us anyway, we need to take action. It's deteriorated to the point the city needs to do something. So if we were called out for some other reason and we saw any of these issues, we would be taking action. But there are a lot of other issues that the state law doesn't allow us to take action on under a rental inspection program, such as peeling paint, height of grass, junk cars.
Yeah.
Those are not health and safety to the tenant. So although they are all in the property maintenance code.
Okay, interesting. Jim, while you're here, Roxanne?
While you're here, Jim, too. I think this is one of the fears that our landlords have, is that we are going to be inspecting to the dirty window level. So can you provide some assurances, you know, about the things that you look for and how we really want to stick to the health and safety?
Absolutely. Rick, let me know if I transpose this RCW again. I made the mistake of transposing one with land use last week with Rick. RCW 5918, Landlord Tenant Act, under the definition of a rental housing inspection tells us that it's limited to health and safety. Now that was put into the law shortly after City of Pasco started their rental inspection program. And if you look at their checklist, they do look at height of grass, they do look at peeling paint, they do look at junk cars. So they're vested. They had that regulation in before the state changed it, and the landlords went to the state and the legislature, saw the problem, and put the definition in to solve the problem.
I'm going to ask something real fast.
Hey, Jim, why don't you just come here?
There are two items regarding electrical on the last page here, and I guess I am concerned about expectation management, that we might think that a basic health and safety Landlord-Tenant Act inspection is going to prevent electrical fires. But if it's the kind of inspection that this sounds like to me, I'm not sure. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Electrical is an interesting topic. A lot of us have really old houses that have knob and tube and wiring in them, and we're all really worried about that. How many of them actually burn? I don't think I could write that as a correction, although it doesn't come close to meeting today's codes. So we have to use a lot of judgment with the electrical, and the IPMC gives us some guidance. Cover plates missing off of high voltage. High voltage is anything over 50 volts. Yeah, that's an electrocution hazard, absolutely. Lights hanging off of their wires, absolutely, it's a fire hazard. The electrical panel not having the fuses or breakers labeled. Well, how do you know which one to turn off if something goes wrong? So that's a safety issue. Did that kind of answer for your question?
What about a
Jack?
cracked cover plate on an electrical switch that, you know, the housing authority would consider that to be a failure? If it's just simply a cracked cover plate?
It would have to be cracked to the point that I would have to make a reasonable judgment that somebody could touch that and their hand would finish it off and go inside.
Okay, good distinction, thank you.
I know we moved past this item, but I'm going to take the luxury of revisiting it briefly, really briefly, about the qualified roster item. I think we're going to need to talk about this a little further at some point in the sense that we keep hearing a lot about reasonable judgment, and it's going to be very difficult for us to fairly institute inspections an understanding of what an inspection means if we have people who are just taking a piece of paper and then using their reasonable judgment, if we haven't gotten them on some kind of same page with our expectation. Anyway, we can come back to that concept, but I think it is important to acknowledge. Anything else before we move on? Okay. So, we have briefly touched on,
Kathy,
yeah, Michael?
can we revisit the incentives idea?
Sure, we haven't even started.
oh,
We
I
can
thought
do
we
that
were-
one next.
Okay, well,
In fact, that is the next one.
I think incentives are good, but sort of like with a roster, I'd rather keep the program really, really small. I don't know if we have time to think that one through. If we can come with a good incentive quickly, I suppose that'd be nice. I'd be open to the idea, but I don't want to complicate our lives by having to look for an incentive and spend too much time on it. That's
Okay.
just my personal opinion.
Okay. Yes, Kelly?
Part of this came out of Mark's work when we went through the principles that he'd put up, which was to focus on basically the bad actors or the people that aren't complying. So I think that the idea for the incentives was not to develop some big, complicated program, but if you were taking care of your property, you had your inspection, you fixed whatever it was that you needed, then basically there'd be some time frame, an idea of a time frame before you would be expected to do your next inspection. Something like that, so that you can focus on the people that are violating and potentially not deciding to fix whatever it is, or repeat offenders. So
I like that incentive. This one talks about incentives for just registering early. I'd rather give incentives for people with clean bills of health.
Yeah, I think that was something we discussed, that there's some clear, easy ways to reward people for having a great first inspection and making it easier for ourselves at the same time.
But the one thing is, if you want people to register, you might want there to be some simple incentive that gets people signed up before you have to start going through the property rolls and seeing who has income property. That's a very time-consuming thing. So we'll see if we can bring you back something that would meet your criteria.
Yeah, Terry?
Well, if we're talking on the incentives.
We are.
I got problems maybe with needing to provide incentives for early registration, but I would like to see incentives for if we have when we have inspections. If a property comes up with a clean bill, it's they've got a clean inspection, that should be an incentive to prolong the next inspection, so that instead of, say, if we go on a 3-year rotation, or for the people with good clean inspections can have it, if it's 3, put off to 5 or something like that. So there is incentives for those property owners who have well-maintained residents and are meeting the inspection. It's just, because it would probably follow if they're running good inspections now, and doesn't change ownership, that they'll probably be good for a little longer. And so I would like to see that kind of thing as an incentive as opposed to necessarily early registration.
Okay, thank you, Terry.
Kind
Roxanne?
of go together, I think, Terry, and I agree
Yeah.
with you.
Yeah.
I was just,
Right.
certainly I agree with what you said.
Yeah.
And we won't know who's going to inspect until we know who's registered. So maybe
Right.
it's an incentive
Yeah.
for registering and getting your inspection done early.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say that for balance in the program, I feel like if we're going to have the negative consequence be fee increase, I think we should have as much of a sliding scale for the positive. So, for example, if you had 3 or 2 or something like that, good inspections, then maybe it would be a longer time in the future years, some scale like that.
I'm hearing a lot of similar thought around that kind of incentive. I am wondering about an early get in the program incentive. We don't want to end up with everybody saying, wait till the city comes after me to get my inspection. So, we can't afford that. Let's just admit that right off the bat. Jack?
Well, we do have an incentive. It's called the penalty clause. And I think that, you know, if you do the right thing, I mean, we don't give incentives for a whole bunch of other things like, you know, registering your car or whatever. It's just like, to me, it seems like the incentive is that you're part of the program and that, you know, you can use the best parts of our program to do that. But if you choose not to do it and you want to go and have us go and bug you, that there is a consequence to that if you do it too much.
Yeah, and I am reminded Seth always used to say,
Who?
Old Man Fleetwood, you know, 80% of people generally comply with the law when they know what it is.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else on incentives? Seeing none, let's move on to this item E, the fifth item. Identifies the cost to the city to enforce the regulations during the term of the program. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. Okay, so identifies the costs to the city to enforce the regulations. This is really important, clearly. Any thoughts from other council members? Jack?
Well, I think whatever it is that we do not touch the general fund in order to pay for this. This is all self-contained, that fees will pay for the administration of this, and the administration also includes the compliance issues associated with the regulations. And I think what we can do is just do our best guess as to what that cost is going to look like. You can research, maybe the staff could research other cities. We've talked about this. There's a lot of examples out there and a lot of information that we can use to see what the what the overall compliance rates are and what the other administrative costs are going to be, such as data entry and working that data to create the the necessary outcomes that we want. And it may take a couple months to go and put that all together, and we may not actually have a fee schedule till January, February. I think that's legitimate. We could probably move on an ordinance today, or at least the direction of what the framework of the ordinance would look like. But as far as the cost element, I think the staff has a lot of work to go and figure out exactly what those individual mechanics are going to look like.
I'm just going to put out there that I don't, thank you, Jack. I appreciate your statement about the general fund. I don't want us to ask for staff to come back with their thoughts about what this could cost, and then we don't like the cost and we say they don't know, they're not creating the program we want because it's too expensive. If we ask them for a program, they're going to come back and tell us what they really think the cost is going to be. We have to acknowledge that as the cost we think that it's going to be, and then come up with a solution. Just want to put that out there. Roxanne, oh, sorry, Kelly?
No, let Roxanne go first.
I just want to make sure I'm totally understanding what this sentence means. So does this sentence mean that we would pay for the inspections? Because that is enforcing the regulations. So I don't know what the total intent was behind this.
Sorry,
I think Rick has it.
okay, great.
The intent is to enforce, that's the enforcement actions. Should we find a correction, an issue during one of the inspections, that's not just a correction notice, minor thing, but someone who either consciously chooses not to comply or refuses to comply, we go to enforcement. And that's the cost of what those kind of enforcements would be, because they tend to be the unintended consequence of implementing a program.
And that would be what I was going to say is the separation of the registration inspection program that we expect to pay for itself. We have one enforcement officer right now.
Right.
So that would be another discussion about how we want to pay for that enforcement officer. If we pay for it with general fund, then we can use that enforcement officer for broader enforcement. If we want to pay for it with fees, then they're more limited. And what are the the penalties for not following up and mitigating an inspection violation, that might be high enough that it would pay for, over time, would pay for another enforcement officer. But it's the enforcement officers that is the issue that we're going to have to wrestle with a little bit, because that's a little bit different than the fee for service and the inspection fee, which are a lot clearer about how much that's going to cost.
Terry and then Michael.
Yeah, I think as we move forward, I'd like to see that, that separation. One, we, the city, charge for and develop that rate for a licensing process. And as part of the licensing process, the requirement of a inspection or at some point along the line, whose cost would be borne by the property owner for the inspection, whether it's from the, so we have those two elements being separate, that we, city administer the licensing, but the inspection be covered by the property owner of inspector of their choice. We could possibly recommend working with or seeing if we could develop a rate, say, through, because the Opportunity Council handles the housing authority's inspection. Maybe if we're going to have something like that, the city could work with the Opportunity Council or something to see if there is a good rate that they could get, because there's going to be volume for their program, and be able to offer it that way. But I would like to see those kept separate.
So can I clarify then? I want to
Yes.
make sure I understand.
Please.
So it was my understanding that the fee that people pay would pay for managing the registration program, and that the landlord would be paying for the inspection program. And then the third leg of that stool is the enforcement. So you'd like to see us come forward with some recommendations on each of those. Is that correct? I'm just going off what Terry
I think so.
just said.
Pinky, you look confused. And then I'm going to take her before you, Michael, because it's on the same line.
I am confused because I totally misunderstood, and I thought that the registration, and it's registration, right, not license? Because you said license.
Yeah, well, license registry, yeah, okay.
That's very different.
Yeah, okay.
So I don't want to,
Registration.
I want to make sure that we're being clear about that. I thought that the registration included the cost of them to get an inspection, so I was a little confused by that, so that's why I had that look on
Well,
my face.
I think, well, just to be clear, I mean, we could do something like that, but the idea was that the city wouldn't be subsidizing the inspections. And we're looking at the most cost-effective way to do the registrations, hopefully using existing business registration programs that we already have, so that we don't have to develop a new system to do it. The inspections, if they're done by a private entity, the city doesn't have to be involved, except to know that a qualified person is doing the inspection and get the results, so.
In
Terry.
terms of the clarification of the three parts of it, though, I think we should look at in terms of the cost of the registration, whatever we're calling it, that cost would include the cost of enforcement as part of that, and then the separate so it's basically the two that we're looking at the costing out of.
That's the part I missed,
Yeah.
and that's why I'm
Yeah.
glad I asked the question.
Yeah, so thank you for that.
So what Terry said is, Terry, your desire would be that the fee of the program covers our ability to administer the program and enforce the
Right.
program.
Exactly.
And then there would be a fee for an inspection that
Would be,
be separate.
yeah,
Okay,
right.
thank you. I'm going to go Michael and then, or I'm sorry, Jack and then Roxanne.
Yeah, so I concur with what Terry was saying, but, also to look at whatever penalties that would come in would help supplement that overall cost.
For enforcement, you mean?
Yeah, for enforcement. with an understanding, I mean, when you're trying to break out the cost of having the necessary code enforcement, that you would back out the revenue that would come off of penalties. Yeah.
And I'm sorry, Roxanne, I had skipped Michael. So Michael, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to comment on exactly this topic. I appreciate, I think Mayor Kelly said it most clearly. There are three components here: the registration and whether or not that, how much of the program and how much of the enforcement that covers. Then there's the inspection, which has to be in some sense separate, because you can opt in or out of that. You can use city inspectors or not. So originally I thought that the one fee would pay for both inspections, but because you're allowed to opt out of inspections, we've got to break it out as a surcharge that you can either accept or not. Out of city inspections, then you'd have to, so I'm going to go the private route. So you have to be able to have a lower fee if you're going to handle inspections yourself, not through city inspectors. So there has to be some separation there. So two levels: registration only, and you do your own private inspection, or registration and city inspection. But then the third leg, as you say, is enforcement. We don't charge people for enforcing rules. We enforce the rules anyway. If there were no program and there was a complaint and there was enforceable conditions, we would pay for it as a general government service, because that's what we do. So we don't now expect enforcement to pay for itself. Enforcement's a cost. We spend millions of dollars on police. It's all for enforcement. We don't expect criminals to cover the cost of enforcement against criminals. So I would like to see some of enforcement, some of the additional maybe enforcement officers may be paid for in part from registration fees, but I personally wouldn't require that the enforcement component itself be covered, because I think that, in my own view, that's a general government obligation to uphold health and safety, and I think we already need to do that.
Good point. Roxanne and then Terry.
I'd just like to suggest that we're making some pretty substantial changes, so I hope we could make a motion and have a second to do that process.
Okay.
Terry?
So under that, under your concept of enforcement, are you willing to do that for downtown parking, that it shouldn't cover itself? Because that's part of our principles. So that comment doesn't necessarily hold. So, because we do ask enforcement to be paid out of the violations and things, and out of that specific funds. So that's why I think this would be probably okay, because we do that in other instances.
Okay. We did all agree we would like this program to be cost neutral, of course. So this is good discussion. I'm going to keep moving.
I'm sorry, I feel like if there's no motion and there's no action, we have not done anything. Because I don't want us to just provide feedback and not have this solidified.
We're getting there.
No. This specific issue, because I know I was going to make a motion before we get out of here that we direct staff to do these, but if you want them on all.
We can come back through and make the motions. I've been taking notes on what I think I heard. If you want to make a motion right now, I'd love to take it.
I just want to make sure we're doing this, because we do this too often.
No, I agree.
Well, this is my last one, so I'm going to try and make sure we do this.
You're learning well.
You're correct.
If this is the last thing I do, I never eat again. We are getting something done here. Okay, I did want to bring one, and we have one item to discuss on this list after we finish this idea, and I have one more element of this. I got to ask, do we even want the city to provide inspection? The cost for us to provide inspection is higher, most likely, considering salaries and benefits through the city, than a private inspector, so just want to put that out there. It can be an option. Maybe people won't take it because our rate would be higher. Jack?
I see this can happen a few ways. I've shared this with a few people about one possible way to have inspectors available, city inspectors available with minimal risk or cost to the city itself. And that is, if we ended up having a registration requirement that people register by July 1st, as has been in our ordinance, that at that time there could be, when you're submitting your application, that you also go and make a statement as to whether or not you want to have a private inspector or a city inspector. And if you check the box that says you want a city inspector, that we would provide you with an annualized rate of however many years that we would have these inspections done, that you divide that into the cost of the annualized rate, or the rate that we would charge for the inspection, and that's how much you would pay. And the fact that you would
Sounds
pay...
complicated.
No, this is a very simple thing. Very,
Okay.
very simple thing.
I'm simple-minded here, I guess.
If you want the inspection, you basically declare it, and you say, that I'm going to pay this for the next X years. That gives our staff an actual count of how many people want to have a city inspection. And at that point, we can go and ramp up to whatever that level is and hire those inspectors, knowing that we have this revenue stream coming in of people that said, I'm willing to go and pay this amount for those inspections. We don't go and over-subscribe on staff by doing that way, and we don't under-subscribe. We actually meet the demand of people that want to go and get a city inspection. We don't know how much the city inspection is going to be until they do a little bit more work. The private sector is going to be whatever the private sector does. We might be able to negotiate something with the Opportunity Council for a bulk rate, and then that could be available either through the city or through a situation where that could be a private inspector, and that an owner could go and get an inspector that way too.
Kathy, can I just, Jack, I appreciate this. I'd like Rick to be able to respond. I think we're getting into the how right now, and I think you might want some options about how to do this that may be the same or different than what you're envisioning. So I'm going to turn it over to Rick, who's going to talk a little bit about how they do it in Seattle.
Okay.
Seattle's program is a random inspection. In essence, it's every year you're in the pot and they pick a number out that they're going to inspect. I think the calculus here is for us to look at the number of inspections we anticipate doing in order to be able to cover it, whether we're going to do some randomized inspections or we're going to do a dutiful one through. And we'll weigh the costs of both of those. That'll help drive us with a recommendation when we come back and say, we'll still accomplish the policy end, but what's the best approach for us to make sure we get good coverage and compliance?
Sounds good, thank you.
The private sector, if we're doing, depending on the volume we do, the private sector might be able to fill in more than adequately. It depends on the sample you wish to go through.
Okay, thanks, Rick. We're going to try and move forward, so real quickly, Roxanne, did you want to add? Okay. I saw some hands here. Jack, were you? Okay, Michael?
I don't think Jack got to make his point clearly, and it's an important one, has to do with program cost. If people at the beginning of the program indicate whether using city inspectors, we will know income and we will know workload, and we can scale the two, so that's how you avoid cost overruns. We know we're going to do X number of inspections, the income will come in at this rate, then it just becomes an easier problem to solve. So I think that was the importance of Jack's comment, is there's a method for the city to know ahead of time so we don't either run out of money or whatever.
I like that, and maybe staff will take that recommendation as they're thinking this through. Jack, did you want to add something real quick?
Yeah, the only concern I have about private, people can go and get a private inspector if they want, it's state law. But the one thing that I have a little concern about, that would be nice to have the number of inspectors overall as narrow as possible, is that it provides more consistency in the actual implementation of those inspections. That if you're looking at a particular, the squishy floor, that we would treat that squishy floor the same way throughout all of the inspectors. And I think having 25 inspectors doing the city is you're going to have 25 different opinions. But if I think with the number of inspections that we really are looking at, it's going to be a inspector load, an FTE load of a much lower number to be able to cover those number of inspections.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to this last item in the memo if we can. Requires staff to report back annually to council on the status to date of the program. No longer pilot program. Is everybody happy with that?
Yeah.
An annual report?
Annual report,
Okay.
sounds good.
Okay. So, we've I wanted to be out of here by 3 at the latest. We have roughly half an hour, a little bit more. We don't have to use all our time. Just a time check, Jack.
I would like to get into my handout of policy questions, which I would like to turn into motions, so we can just kind of move through them.
Okay, I'm actually going to try to get some motions with what the work we've just done first, if we can. So if it's useful, what we could do is make a couple of motions on this and see if we can give staff direction accordingly with the suggested language at the bottom. The suggested language at the bottom is move to direct staff to prepare a rental registration process consistent both with the overarching principles as outlined by council and specific implementation steps. We would say as amended, of course. Terry?
I think part of that's okay, but there are things left out with this that I think we need to deal with first,
Okay.
like such as if we're inspection and what kind of a cycle of inspection that we're going to do, and direct staff to put that also as part of this. If we want a 3-year turnover of inspection, then we should include that with that as for our direction to staff, so that they have a basis for developing this with, rather than just leave it open-ended.
Okay. Roxanne?
I'm really anxious to see what staff is going to present in terms of the cost of all of these different options. So I'm hearing random inspections, I'm hearing inspections of all properties, percentage of inspections annually. So that's what I hope staff could bring forward so we can have more informed decisions. That's why I'm not ready to vote on something right now, because I don't know what it would cost.
Right. So I think that's a good point. So I think what we're trying to do is get to a place where we can give staff enough clarity that they can tell us how much things are going to cost. Does that sound okay, Terry?
But before they can develop a cost, that what it's going to cost us, we need to establish
The time frame.
the time frame in which we're going to have inspections completed. So I think that should be included with this, whether it's and they can, give us recommendations regarding a random 1/3 based on, because our staff has done a lot of work already with the planning committee in terms of looking at some of this in terms of single ownership or multi-family or residential places and doing percentage of that. They've already done that work. But if we give them a time frame in which we want this done, it would facilitate them getting down to a cost a little better. So I think that's necessary,
Okay.
Before.
Well, we do have these principles that would say housing must be safe for the renter and a program must be cost neutral. So we do have some bookends, but I think I hear what you're saying, like, should we establish within 10 years something or within 3 years something?
Right.
Okay. Yes, Rick?
If I might, I'd be happy to come back as we research it and come back with a high and low frequency in terms of how many inspections and, all inspected within a 3-year horizon or random inspection, and you could weigh the differences. What I can say is other jurisdictions have found that they get fairly good compliance with fairly robust random inspection. So we can come back and weigh that for you, but I hear it loud and clear that you want to see that range.
Thank you, Rick. Roxanne?
I just want us to be really, really careful about this, because I think we can sit up here and make the policy, but we have to really think about the consequences of this. Because, for example, the more inspections that we do, it just gets more expensive. And I don't like that I'm already hearing that landlords are talking about working together to ensure that whatever the cost of the inspection will be that we set will then become a part of the first, last, and damage deposit. So we just need to be really careful that this doesn't raise rent so substantially that we create unaffordable rental housing. So I just want us to keep that in mind.
I agree with that. That would be asinine because we'd be talking one language out one side of our mouths and another out the other side. Jack?
So along that same line, the Herald, a couple years ago, they ran a story about how market conditions, just in terms of market conditions of supply and demand, would increase rent by $50 per unit per month, just because of supply and demand. The type of program that we're talking about, even in the most aggressive way, we're talking about less than $10. And here we're providing, health and safety issues so that people don't go and get injured, they don't get harmed through their health, and they don't die. And I think that's a small price to pay compared to the $50, which is just simply, I think I can just make an extra $50 because of the supply of housing. I'm not as concerned about that as far as an impact to the property owners. I think they have a responsibility in the sense that this is a business, and that they do have a responsibility to provide good and adequate housing. If this is the minimum cost to be able to go and do that, I think that it's a fair thing. And I don't see any real major red flags throughout any of the discussion that we talked about that's going to be a deal killer when it comes to cost. I think the registration part of it is very low. The inspection, even looking at the worst case scenario of numbers that we've been told, if you take that and amortize that over the number of years that we're talking about maybe having inspections done, it's minimal. It really is minimal. And I think that we need to look at it that way as in a business way and in a fiduciary responsibility to the tenants and the citizens of this community, and also to the owners too, that this doesn't have to cost that much money. And I don't know, Kathy, it seems like you're interested in getting a motion on A through F. Is that what you're looking for? Because I want to move this along myself.
The principles and as many specifics as we can provide, yes.
Okay, well, we already made a motion on the principles?
Yep.
Okay, so I would move that we accept A through F as we discussed it in this work session today.
I'll second it.
Okay, we have a motion and a second discussion on that motion. Pinky?
I'd like them to be individual.
Individual motions?
Yeah, I don't want to go through A through F and blanket say yes. I'm not comfortable with that.
Just a clarification. We do that, and the bottom line, staff's going to come back in 90 days, and then we vote on the whole program as it's written.
True.
Or as it's brought back to us,
Correct.
right?
Yes. So this is to direct staff to come back consistent with the principles we agreed on, with a program that considers these items. It considers these items in the program. I think the more important thing to ensure is that we're not leaving things out for staff to consider. We can always nix things in the future. If we don't talk about it now, when we send them away to consider, they're not going to consider. So if there are things to add, now is the time. Jack?
I'm more interested right now in adopting an ordinance. A lot of the stuff that we've talked about today are administrative details that the administration will go and come back to us with.
Go ahead.
And outside of maybe just direction about, how often we might want to have inspections, I think that could be part of an ordinance. It's administrative, and that is the basic framework for a program that we would be looking for. After that, the administrative details can come back to the council for a fee schedule and any other issues that might be associated with that. If we find out that there is a real fatal flaw in the ordinance that we had adopted, as Terry mentioned earlier, we can simply go and change it with 4 votes, as another ordinance. But I think as a statement to ourselves and to the community of what we want to do, I think having an ordinance established now and allow the staff to go and use that ordinance as its direction of how to come back to us with, the actual mechanics of how to implement that, To me, I think that that's a sound way of going about it.
Well, that's fine, but they still have to come back.
Yeah.
With a final draft of a final ordinance, correct?
Well, no. No, we would pass the ordinance, and then they'd come back.
The only ordinance we have in front of us now is registration.
Well, we're
Well,
not
we
done
would
yet.
change that. That would be the framework that we would.
I'm really uncomfortable with that idea. I think it's putting the solution before the mechanism or the ideal. I mean, we're very close to having some very clear goals here. We could get staff to come back with clear costs, and then we would be able to identify within 90 days exactly what's going to happen next. We could have some predictability and consistency. Michael?
I think I disagree with moving this memo forward, not because I disagree with its content, but because I view it as a step backwards. This is going over material that was already discovered. This is nothing new that wasn't already in a 6-0 unanimously approved city council directive a year and a half ago. I don't think this particularly moves us forward, but I do think the ordinance is like really close to being approved if you just simply put back in, I think, some language that requires, a random proactive inspection. And then I think the ordinance is pretty ready to go. The ordinance is intentionally written to have the fee schedule and the checklist be separate documents. So, and I think, by the way, on the checklist, add in pests, and I think this is ready to go. So I'll call this mostly done. I'll call the fee schedule the farthest thing away from being approved because it has to do with cost estimating. But I think the ordinance is almost ready to go. And I think approving this rather than spending a little more time on the ordinance and deciding the few key decisions left to finalize the ordinance, I think this would take us longer unnecessarily. It was a good discussion, and I agree with what we've come up with for the most part. But I think if we focus on the few remaining decisions that are necessary to finalize the ordinance, I think that'd be a better use of our time, because then it allows those longer issues, the cost estimation issues that require staff work to then proceed, over the next month or two. But I think we could try to finish our work sooner than that on the ordinance component.
Terry?
Yeah, I'm willing to vote on this simply because this is basically what we've already agreed on, and this work has been done by the planning committee previously. But if we leave it just as this, it's just kicking the can down the road again, and we haven't done a damn thing. We've already agreed on all these principles. I mean, that's already been done. We had a hearing about it. We've got an ordinance that we could, with a few tweaks, and I know Jack's done the tweaks on them, and we could be voting on them and on that part, and then ask staff, or we could vote on them to take this ordinance with this and bring it back as that, But we at least have done something. But with this, we've already, this is a good discussion because we're agreeing on it, but we've already agreed on these principles before, and staff has already went and done that work. But now I know we got a new director who's going to do it, but this is what, the third director, at least, that's worked on this, and I don't see where it's going to take us any farther down the road. So I've got real concerns if we just pass this and say, staff, go off and bring us back something that, are we going to ever take any action on anything?
Okay, I hear that. That's legit. Peter, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to, right now you have a registration-only ordinance, and there are some substantive issues that you're talking about that will require some crafting, and I appreciate the ideas of specific changes in the ordinance, but all these things it's like a thread, and you pull on something, and then you get changed something else in the ordinance, but you have the concept of accepting other inspections in lieu of, you have the concept of whether we're accepting just a credentialed list or whether we're going to be testing. These are things that will impact the ordinance, and they're substantive, and it's not going to be a real quick turnaround. I'm not saying, we can't turn it around, but I just wanted to point out, I want to, make sure that expectations are manageable in terms of some of those substantive questions that will impact the ordinance.
And this was advertised as a work session. That probably doesn't matter if you guys want to take action or not. But if you have specific amendments that you'd like to make to the ordinance that's in front of us, which I think I hear Terry saying that that's what he wants to do, and I don't know, Jack, if that was your intention, about that. What we were trying to do is get in concept, different from what Roxanne first proposes. We want inspections of all properties, so that was a difference that we wanted in an ordinance. And then some other basic differences that we wanted in an ordinance so that you could vote on it the next time you meet. If you want to vote on something now, it just seems like the amendments should be reviewed by the staff, or, I mean, something should happen.
Okay.
But I don't want to keep it, we're all ready to get it done by December 15th, because Kathy's leaving. We don't want to wait past then.
We're leaving anyway on that.
Not the impetus to do it necessarily, but,
So we're not thinking of making it wait. I just want to make sure we're not rushing it for both the public and the staff to make sure that it's right before we vote on it.
right. So, yeah, I'm just giggling about the rushing it part. Not that that's your, I mean, everyone can giggle about that. I do want to point out, the whole discussion we had this afternoon shows, I think, that we haven't been all on the same page on all these things yet. And we had some good discussion, and I think we have some consensus around a number of items. And we could give some more specific direction based on this discussion, like Jack moved and Terry seconded, that I can't promise, I don't run the staff, but I would hope that we would have a quick response, as quick as possible, as to what this direction would look like amending our ordinance.
It might be helpful if you went through Jack's amendments and adopted them however you want to, because that would be more specific about, we want this element, we want this element, we want this element, the way that Jack's proposed it, understanding that at our next meeting, we'll bring back a written ordinance for you. I'm feeling like we can't bring it back tonight for you to get it done, but certainly you can make your decisions today if that's what you
Meeting tonight, let's
There
be
is no
clear.
meeting
Well,
tonight.
then, good, we can't do it tonight.
Not tonight.
I just want to make sure we do it right, that's all, and that the staff can write the full ordinance up for you. And I think that if Jack has amendments, they kind of line up with these, that maybe that would work. But as far as voting on an ordinance right now, I don't know, that's up to you, whether
Okay.
you want to do it or not.
We do have a motion and a second to make a recommendation based on our discussion today to staff. We did not take the items separately, that was Pinky's desire. But is there anyone who wants to speak to that motion additionally? Michael?
I wouldn't mind taking them separately, but I could vote them as a package. But the part that I want to make sure is not in the motion is this whole 90-day business, because I don't want us to wait 90 days to start. That's above the motion. It talks about
Okay,
bringing
yep.
stuff back in 90 days.
Sure.
If that's part of the motion, I will vote no, because some of these
It's
things.
not part of the motion.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'd be happy to support Pinky's suggestion if everyone else also agreed.
Okay, then, so we had a motion, oh, Pinky.
I would be willing to do that if I could add just one more comment and concern about one of these lines. I would be willing to pass them all together.
Could you,
We're talking about
Your memo.
Rick's memo.
Rick's memo.
First.
Okay.
could we hear what
Yeah,
Pinky's
Pinky, go ahead.
ad is?
Yeah, well, I'm just going to go back to B, item B, and I just want to put my personal interpretation on that. And that is that if we don't have one consistent system that everybody goes through, whether it's a training or whatever it is, to say, then everything is up for interpretation. And that's what I feel uncomfortable with. In my day job, I've, worked with contractors and rebates, and I know what it's like. We tried it when they were just contractors, and there was nothing consistent across the board. It was subject to interpretation. There was no consistency, and there was no etiquette and accountability. And that is my concern, is if we don't have something that whether, and then the city doesn't have any influence on those contractors if if they are not being appropriate in people's homes, or if they are not following all the same consistency. And I feel pretty strongly about this because I see this every day in my regular job. So whether, even if it's just one day that they all come and we say, cracked faceplates are okay if you can't get your hand through it. Everybody agrees, not just this interpretation. So that's my one concern, is I would like something that is consistent and everybody be vetted at one point. So that's my only thought.
Michael?
I think you and I see this quite differently. As I see it, state law has already invented a wheel. They've already told us who's qualified. Those people are already professional. They're already licensed. They're already governed by a licensing body. They already have standards of professional conduct that they're supposed to be held to. We don't need to reinvent the wheel that already exists, and it does us a great deal of benefit to use that existing wheel. If we invent a second wheel, another hoop we have people to go through, I think that's an unnecessary layer of bureaucracy, and more to the point, we don't want to have to say that Joe is okay and then Joe goes and misbehaves. If Joe goes and misbehaves under the current system, he has his own liability, his own exposure, his own penalties that he will face on his own as a private inspector, and he will have professional discipline from his licensing agency. We don't need to get in there. If we get in there, now we're an additional layer. I don't think we should take on the responsibility or the liability, and I don't think it's necessary. So I don't want the roster. I want the roster to be informational only. I agree with the idea of running as much city education as possible, and the roster could just say, these are the people who've taken the course. But I don't think the course should be qualification or a threshold or a necessary step for anyone. So I think you and I are seeing the roster quite differently.
Okay, well, what we're trying to do right now, I appreciate both your comments. What we're trying to do right now is get some specificity for staff, and I think we've given it on this item. And we have a motion and a second on this item. Is there any further discussion, Jack?
Yeah, I just want to be clear that this, that A through F is, the language that is here is actually not what we're approving. It's
Right.
this language plus the comments that we have made during
Yes.
the discussion of these items.
Correct. Thank you.
Including what Pinky was discussing.
Yes, thank you. This was a jumping off point for our discussion, which is also part of the recommendation. Any further discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Okay, motion passes 7-0. I'm going to make a motion that we add a third principle to the two overarching principles already agreed upon, and that the third principle is any proposed program must provide consistency and predictability for the city, landlords, inspectors, and renters.
Second.
The motion and a second. Is there any discussion?
Almond apple pie.
Okay, seeing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes 7-0. Okay, we have 14 minutes to go crazy on anything else any of you want to do. Terry, and then Roxanne, and then Jack.
Well, I really think for staff to come back and bring back any kind of an ordinance or whatever, we have to address the issue of inspection and time frame for inspection. Some direction, because we haven't given any direction at this point to them.
Or you mean like how frequently they occur, or within
That's-
when everyone would be inspected?
That's right.
Or any of those things?
Those things.
Okay.
We haven't done that yet. And
That's
I
correct.
really think that that is necessary for us to do as part of this, so that they can give us a proper estimate of cost and other things when they bring this back.
Yeah. I think my fear is if we say one specific thing and they bring it back and it's so expensive or something, we can't figure out how to work with it, then we don't have another option. So I would like to try and get options. Yes, Rick?
Yeah, what I might suggest is we can do some research of the jurisdictions that have adopted similar ordinances, ask their experiences on inspection and frequency, what percentage of the market they survey, and get back, use that as sort of a metric. They're the only ones who've done it. and have something in the test of what they found and how often it was to be effective. Hopefully, it'll give us some guidance. I could certainly do that.
Is it? Well, I'll yield to Jack, 'cause I know Jack's got some specific ideas. I just want to make sure that we have it in there, that, not that we come back and, oh, well, we'll do a random sampling over the next 5 years, and that's good. Because that's not my intention with this, and I don't think with the work of this, that it's, just.
Well, and can I say, I think the difference I've heard from previous discussions to this discussion is it's the how we get the inspections done. It's not whether or not everyone needs an inspection. So I think we've come full circle now.
Right.
And we think that every unit should be inspected, or every property should be inspected. So I think what Rick's talking about is not whether or not they should be inspected, but what the time frame is, and some of them are going to be through the city and some of them are going to be through private. So unless I think everyone agrees with that.
Because I think, getting, one of my objections before is that we don't have the information, and this is going to get us a lot more information in terms of the quality of rental overall. So the sooner, I've come pretty full circle with it, that the sooner this is done, the better. That way we know what we're looking at, and we're getting this done. And so
That's true. We will start getting information immediately, which will be helpful right out of the
period
gates.
or something like that would be, I would
Okay.
like to see.
Roxanne?
I'm not willing to put a time frame on this. We do not know what the best practices are. We have differing views about exactly what we should do versus inspecting all properties, randomly inspecting a percentage of properties. I want to know what the costs are that are associated with that before I'll take any vote on this kind of issue.
I gotta say, I agree with that.
Before you'll vote for it, you would take a vote, right?
Yeah, I'll
But
vote no.
you just, okay, that's okay.
Jack?
I want to work through and make motions associated with some specific changes to the registration-only ordinance.
Okay, well, we have 10 minutes, and we do need to discuss how we're going to deal with this next, what the next steps are. So if we're going to go through the ordinance and make changes, do we need another meeting, or do we need to hear from staff based on the recommendations we've already made? Any thoughts there, folks?
Yeah.
Ask that. Yes, Roxanne?
My concern is if staff has had time to vet this, to see if it will work for staff.
I'm
even.
sorry, what?
Has staff had time to vet all of your changes?
I gave this to them last week.
And if this
But that's not
is similar
approval.
to, okay. Terry?
I think staff has probably had enough time, as much time to vet this as we've had, more time than we've had to vet what was just presented to us. And we just voted on it. So I think we should at least be able to go through some of these and have a discussion, because I know Jack's worked on it pretty hard as chair of the committee and stuff, so we should.
These changes are fairly
Right.
straightforward. Some of it's just, it's basically more housekeeping things, but there are two specific issues that I think that would deserve more attention, and maybe we don't vote on them today. I don't know. But the first change.
Wait, hold on
May I
one second.
proceed?
Sorry, I'm just going to get Peter real fast before we do that.
Yeah, I had a chance to look at these this morning, and what I would like to say is if you identify exactly what you're accomplishing, if you're not wedded to the exact terminology, that would be helpful, because there's obviously going to be changes made, and as long as you identify what it is you're trying to accomplish with the word change, that would be the most helpful.
And that was the intent of what I wanted to do. I wanted to specifically lay out changes, but understanding that legally we may end up having to tweak the words around to accomplish the same goals. So the first few, and this has more to do with, I think, a discussion between legal and planning staff, is the whether or not to include issues associated around ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and carriage houses. It takes up the first few pages of potential changes. And that has to do with the fact that we already have language in the ordinance that talks about owner-occupied dwellings that are 2 units or less. To me, it's a redundant type of definition, and we wouldn't necessarily need those types of language in there if we just went and included the owner-occupied of 2 units or less. And I tried to reflect that in there, and it's not so much that we would take direction on that, but I would just offer that to you as a way to make the ordinance cleaner. So, but if you really feel that way, I guess we can conclude it's no harm, no foul on that one. But at the same time, it just seems like it's a redundant type of language in there. So the first change would be on page 5 of the ordinance, and it has to do with the previous ordinance we had. We would break out the registration program where, part of the city east and west of the freeway would be considered 2 different time frames. And under this approach, it's just basically everybody on July 1st. This is on page 5 at the bottom.
Yeah.
Page 5 of the ordinance.
The ones you handed out?
It's the 5th page.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of the ordinance I handed out, it's page 5 of that ordinance. And it's under section 6.15.040A.
Jack, can you explain why you deleted that part?
Because at the time that we were doing this, it seemed like, that was a way of being able to segregate the community in a previous approach of how to go about the ordinance. And to me, it seems like it would be a lot easier just if we're marketing the fact that this ordinance is happening just citywide, just get everything all done at one time. And then also, we would know how many people are participating in the inspection program if we go down that route. So to me, it seems like it would be better and easier and more efficient for us to go and say, one deadline, everybody meets it.
So this is just registration. They wouldn't have to have been inspected.
That's correct.
Peter?
Yeah, the intent behind that was to kind of divide up the workload, knowing that you're going to have someone that's going to be taking in this registration information, putting it into some sort of database. We actually, I think, had some discussion about dividing up even further. We said, okay, well, let's at least divide it up into, half the city at one period of time and then half the city at the other, because then when you have your annual renewals, you would hopefully have it divided up to some extent then as well. But to have it all on once, there was a concern that basically you'd have that staff person, and given human nature, you would have this kind of flood of applications all at the end. So that was driven by an administrative concern about how you're going to handle the wave of information at a certain point in time during the year. That was the intent behind it.
Pinky?
I just wanted to comment on that, Jack. I actually think that's really smart, because I think we're dividing it just confuses everyone, and it's a way for them to go, oh, I thought I was on that side of town. And so I was never really comfortable with that. I do understand that it is more work for someone, but if the ACA can register 3 million people in a month, I think we can do 8,000 in a year, or 6 months, right? July?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so are we looking for individual motions on these things?
Why don't you
Easier.
read through the whole thing?
No,
and
do
if,
individual
and,
motions.
and if nobody has any objection, we can move the whole thing and be done with
We
it.
should individual.
That's just an idea, because we
I
could
would be
spend
fine with
another,
that.
I got to leave at 3:30. I know we want to get something done, so.
Oh, yeah, we're done at 3 today.
Individual motions, you get some progress.
Okay, so I move that we, on section 6.15.040, subsection A, that we delete the words "for all rental properties west of I-5" and beginning on January 1st, 2016, for all rental properties east of I-5.
Second.
Okay, there's a motion and a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? No. Sorry, Kelly, did you have something to add? Pardon me? Perhaps be disappointed by reality. Okay, motion passed 6-1 with layman in opposition.
On page 7, on page 6, there's another ADU issue. On page 7, it has to deal with the declaration of compliance. And I just wanted to simply kind of add additional words that would provide for an understanding that we might have inspections. And maybe
If issued, okay.
So it would, under subsection 12, it would read a declaration of compliance as described in BMC 61540I, and then add the words, and if issued, a certificate of inspection as described in BMC 6.15.050 and BMC 6.15.070, which has been issued within the past calendar year. This has to deal with, you either have a declaration of compliance or you actually have a certificate of inspection because your unit was inspected. This language would help clarify that. And again, if Peter has issues with that, then,
So this would be in addition to your declaration of compliance, if you had a certificate of inspection, that would be posted as well.
Yeah, that actually would supplant the declaration of compliance.
Okay.
If you had a certificate of inspection, that was that would trump the need for a declaration of compliance.
Yes, Peter.
Just to be clear, I would just interpret this as a way to reinsert an inspection requirement whenever that's been required over the course of, for that particular property at that particular renewal period.
Okay.
And we would insert that wherever this type of language, wherever it makes sense.
Okay.
Okay. So that, and then also on page 8, I'm going to do that. On page 8, there's language that was suggested by staff in the last, and I want to just officially endorse that. So I would make a motion, well,
you didn't move this last language.
I was going to do it all at one time.
Why don't you do these
Okay,
two
so
and then we're done?
Number 12, as I read, I move that.
Second.
Okay, there's a motion and a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes 7-0.
On page 8, underneath section H, there would be a new section I, and then under the declaration of compliance, there's also additional language that's staff provided language for both of those. You want me to read them into the record?
What was that, Michael? Oh, okay. Jack, isn't this, I guess you need to read it just so we're all on the same page.
Okay.
But isn't this, doesn't this duplicate what's already in existence? That they have to give landlord-tenant right information at the time of the rental agreement?
This is language provided by staff.
Okay.
So, planning staff.
So Jim wanted this added? Okay.
You want me to read it?
I don't think it's necessary at this point.
Okay, well, I move to include those two clauses.
Second.
Okay, motion and a second. Any discussion on this motion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion passes 7-0.
On page 9,
Okay,
On
how much longer is this? Because we're supposed to be done.
Shouldn't take too
There's
much.
only like 3 items,
I'm
I
going to
think.
do 2, and I'm going to leave the big one alone.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay, so on subsection A, under 0.0, or 050, I'm proposing so that it would read, for purposes of furthering compliance with this chapter, rental properties or specific residential housing units, strike the word may, include the word shall, be subject to a certificate of inspection requirement under this section, and add the words, this section and BMC 6.15.070 as a non-exclusive remedy to gain code compliance. This is a preparation of having a required inspection component to this particular program, where it's not a registration program anymore, but it's a registration and inspection program.
Let me ask a point, Peter. Does this, would this still be fine language if there are random inspections only required?
This is a section that originally we had a percentage inspection requirement. I took it out when we made it registration only. So I'm just taking this motion as we're going to have to rework this paragraph so that we have some idea of how many inspections are going to occur over what period of time annually. But that's how I take that.
Okay. That was a motion.
That's a motion.
And I heard a second. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, motion passes 7-0. Is there one more, Jack?
On page 11, this is under the limitation section. This would be for both number 4 and 5. Number 4 says, if a rental property has 20 or fewer rental units, no more than 4 rental units at the rental property may be selected. And then to add the words, by the building inspector or code compliance officer. And then it goes back into the regular language of to provide a certificate of inspection as long as the initial inspection reveals that no conditions exist that endanger or impair the health or safety of a tenant. And basically the same type of language for subsection 5 for larger units that are more than 21. It's kind of the same language. And this was to actually identify who is selecting the units to be inspected versus, the owner could just go and say, well, these, these are clean. So I moved this language.
Second.
Okay, there's a motion and a second. Any discussion? Anything from staff on that? Peter?
The language that was there was straight out of the RCW, but I'll just double check and make sure if there's some contrary intent that it can't be selected by the city. I suspect that is fine.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, motion passes 7-0. So you have one final item that'll take longer and we'll address another time.
Actually, it looks like 2 different items, but we'll do that later.
Okay, we'll do that later. And so I'm just going to say we're adjourned.